This is your host Swapnil Bhartiya, and welcome to another episode of TFiR Let's Talk. And today we have with us once again Austin Parker, Head of Developer Relations at Lightstep. Austin, it's great to have you on the show.
Hey, it's great to be here.
SLO Conf was there a few weeks or month. Time passes so fast that it's hard to keep track. During the conference, what kind of discussions you saw? How much awareness is there about SLOs, and how folks are looking at the whole tracing, monitoring, tracking? So just talk about your observations from the conference.
Yeah. So first, thanks for having me on again. It's really great to be here. SLO Conf, I believe this was the second year they've done this, and it was really remarkable to me to see kind of the growth in interest from one year to the next. I want to say there was about 3,000 people that had registered and showed up for it. And it was in a really great format where there's these little bite size, 5-10 minute talks. So you can just kind of listen to them. So it was really possible to hear a lot of things. And what we saw was not only this sort of emerging consensus about SLOs as a primary observability instrument, but also how people are using them in really innovative ways. It is still kind of early days, I think, for SLOs. Um, Looking at the past couple of years, they've gone from being very kind of niche or really only used in kind of larger enterprises that have very mature observability practices. But what we're seeing now is more people kind of bringing them down market a bit and making it easier to access and to implement those practices in kind of more average day-to-day teams, right? And I think that's what you really saw with SLO Conf this year, is that heightened awareness, that sort of shift down market, and also maybe a broadening of what you can use SLOs for. So I mean, traditionally, your service level objective is going to be really tightly focused around how are people, how are end users and customers, experiencing your website or product or whatever, right? But there were talks about SLOs for security. There were talks about, you know, SLOs for sort of organizational metrics and management and on-call time and things like that. So it's interesting how broadly you can apply SLOs to things outside of just that narrow focus on application performance.
Since you talked about the span or scope as well, going all the way from there to security, I think it's very important to just quickly remind our viewers also that what SLO actually stands for.
The service level objective, or SLO, is a measurement of system performance, right? And it does this by connecting business value to sort of underlying service level indicators. A service level indicator being something that we're all familiar with, right? Like request latency or CPU utilization or concurrent user sessions or any sort of metric that you can track. What's important about SLOs and what differentiates them, I think, from a traditional monitoring practice is that an SLO really tries to align those SLIs with some visible, tangible business metric or value, right? So it's less saying, hey, the CPU utilization is really high. We want to have an alert set up if it goes over 90%, or P99 or some tail latency of this particular API endpoint is very high. It says for 80% of customers that are going through this checkout flow, we want it to complete in under 500 milliseconds. And then that statement gives you a couple things. One is it helps you identify, well, these are the SLIs that contribute to that SLO. Two, and I think this is what's really important, is it gives you kind of this budget, right? It gives you an error budget of here's room in this calculation that 20% or so of customers that we're saying can have an experience worse than that. That error budget gives you room not only to kind of improve your software and make changes and so on and so forth, but it also kind of recognizes something that I think a lot of people miss in when they think about software reliability is systems are complex and they're getting more and more complex. You can't just say we're going to have 100% uptime or 99.999% uptime, right? You're paying so much for those incremental improvements in reliability. And SLO gives you a lot of freedom to be able to say, like, well, it's actually okay if every now and then someone maybe has a 1 second checkout, right? Like we accept that that's going to happen. Sometimes that happens for reasons that are within our control. Sometimes it happens for reasons that are outside of our control. The SLO really codifies that, gives you room to experiment and gives you room to grow, both for intentional kind of performance changes, but also recognizing the unintentional changes that can cause, deleterious effects.
What's the problem with traditional model of monitoring that you feel that SLOs is the right approach there?
The primary problem with monitoring practice is that if I tell you we're going to go monitor an application, what does that mean, right? What do you need to look for? Most of the time in kind of a traditional monitoring setup, that means you're going to go and you're going to create a dashboard, and those dashboards are going to have a lot of charts on them. They're going to have line charts, they're going to have, top lists, they're going to have big numbers, they're going to have all these different little primitive ways to visualize data. You as a engineer or as an SRE or as, whoever you are, you have to look at that data and you have to look at those charts and you have to say, okay, I have a bunch of raw data. I need to interpret it. I need to display it. So I need to figure out queries that can represent my system state. I build a dashboard full of those charts, and then you're done, right? You say, okay, I have my dashboard. This has all my key metrics on it, and I'm going to hand this off to someone and they can look at it and they can figure out if there's a problem. Here's where that falls short. There's kind of three big reasons. One is that we tend, those dashboards themselves can become very brittle. They can rot. They require constant care and feeding and maintenance. We have to make sure that those underlying metrics didn't change what they represent. We have to make sure that, as we grow and scale and change our application, that we're adding new metrics or keeping them up to date. And then we have to refresh those dashboards. And that's a lot of effort that quite often, to be honest, just isn't put into this, right? Even you need specialized teams, you need people whose job it is to kind of keep on top of that. And then those changes have to be communicated to the end users, to the engineers that are actually responsible for monitoring those dashboards, which adds even more friction. Another big reason this fails is more to do with, how much distance there is between the people that are building the dashboards and putting them together and the people that are responsible for using them to interpret what's going on, right? If you hand me a dashboard, like I can go and I can, like let's say I go into Grafana, I, find some Kubernetes dashboard on the internet, I plug that in there, and then I have this big complex dashboard that shows me what's going on in my Kubernetes cluster. If I'm not a Kubernetes expert, all of that is going to just be Greek to me, right? It's a ton of information that I don't really have the context for. I don't know how these things relate to each other. I don't know, if this line goes up, is that bad? Is that good? Right? Like it requires a lot of domain knowledge that not every engineer is going to have. And that adds in, friction, but it also adds in frustration because you as the engineer, you feel like you're constantly having to like go and learn about all this new stuff, right? And yes, that's part of the job, but I feel like most engineers, they don't necessarily want to become an expert on every single part of their stack. And as the stack gets more complex, we're effectively mandating that they do become experts on this whole thing. The third reason that I think that traditional query monitoring approach isn't really valuable is that it's really about alerts. So you have your dashboard, you have your queries, it's great. You have to make some sort of prediction about like what is the state of the system, at what point is this so out of spec or so out of whack that I want to tell a human being, hey, come in here and look at this. And that's what alerting does for us, right? We put a horizontal line across our dashboard or across one of our visualizations and say, this is the threshold. If the line goes above this or goes below this, then, tell someone. But again, those alerts require care and feeding and maintenance. Those alerts require a lot of cognitive load in order to understand what does this actually mean? How does this relate to other parts of the system? Those three reasons are all due to kind of two main things. One, like I said, a lack of context about, what's the relationship between these metrics and what's going on. And two, sort of update and care and feeding overload, right? So SLOs fix the first part of those by tying business value back to a metric, back to a service level indicator. So anyone that looks at it, especially, you might not know how Kubernetes works, but you do know, like, okay, if people can't check out, or if this particular API route that I'm responsible for is being very slow, that's a problem. That's causing pain for my users. I need to fix that. On sort of the care and feeding side, because SLOs are really aggregates of a lot of other pieces of data, they tend to be a little easier to actually take care of. And that sounds counterintuitive, right? Because I'm saying, here's a thing that requires more stuff, but you have less SLOs, because if you look at your system, you don't have, a million interaction points. I mean, maybe you do, but the actual kind of end user journeys you care about through your application tend to be more tightly scoped. There tends to be a countable amount of them. So you can actually have fewer SLOs that are of higher quality. So the overall maintenance burden is reduced because you're only having to care about, 10 or 20% of the alerts or monitors that you might have had to care about before.
When we look at the whole DevOps movement, the whole idea was to break down old silos, bring folks together, but that problem is still there. So talk about, specifically that how SLOs solve that problem, and also culturally how you're seeing things are changing to further enable so that organization can embrace this approach as well.
I believe the real connection here between kind of, you know observability teams, SRE teams, the people that are usually tasked with this sort of monitoring workload, and the engineers that are building code and shipping it, is that it's an organizational, byproduct of just the way that big groups of people have to organize themselves, right? Like I think DevOps and the idea of shifting left and the idea of making us all kind of experts of building, running, shipping, da da da. When you really get down into the weeds and you look at how, like, especially in the enterprise, people are going about doing this, it's not quite so simple, right? And the reason is that we might have changed the development culture, but we didn't really change sort of the organizational culture. We didn't change, you know, how is money allocated, right? Like, you still have to say, here's a team, we want to hire X engineers. This is our kind of capital budget. This is our operating budget. This is how ladders and promotions and all that work. And that hierarchical way of building an organization runs kind of counter to what you need, I think, to have a full DevOps transformation. So if we accept that we can't or are unlikely to change our organizations to make them flatter and less hierarchical, and to kind of fix those problems, and not everyone considers that a problem, but let's assume that it is. We can't fix that. So what do we have to do? We have to come up with these constructs that help us break down those barriers in ways that don't require organizational chop and churn. And I think that's SLOs for you in a nutshell, right? Because they're not something that necessarily are opinionated about how you're organizing your teams. I can have an SRE team, that an observability team, for example, that is responsible for creating metrics, creating SLOs, building monitors and alerts and all that sort of stuff. But they can work collaboratively with engineers, with product managers, with customer service and customer success, with account managers, right? Like, you can start to pull in people from all around the organization because you're able to center the conversation around customer value. And that's something that, someone in CS might not necessarily care about Kubernetes. They might not necessarily care about, like, what API framework you're using. The customer that you're building your product for certainly doesn't care about any of that. They don't care what library you're using. They want it to work. So by using SLOs and saying, like, okay, here's the thing we actually care about. We care about customer experience. Then that's something you can take to other parts of the organization and say, look, you might not know or care about all these details down here, these technical details. You don't have to. we need to align on what is the customer experience that we care about monitoring. And then, as an SRE team or an observability team, they can come in and help to, pick the things that need to be monitored from a technical standpoint to align with that, business value we're trying to create.
First of all, thanks for explaining that. Second thing that I was about to ask that question also, that when we do talk about SLOs, and I will ask it because it's really important. How will you connect or associate SLO with business success so that we are not, once again, it's not about technology for the sake of technology. Yes, you're right. They don't, customer success folks, they don't care about the underneath technology. To be honest with you, between you and me as well, these technologies we can love to talk as much, but in the end, we are trying to solve a specific problem. These are means to an end. So we should not get too much. I mean, we can because we love technology, but they don't. So can you talk about the business value that SLOs can bring to enterprise users?
Yeah. What I've seen, I've talked to a few customers at Lightstep that have done this, is they have built SLOs in as part of an overall strategy of democratizing data. And that kind of goes both ways. So some of that is going to sort of frontline tier 1, tier 2 support and saying, look, here's, you can go and you can see sort of really detailed data about customer experiences, customer journeys. You can see these SLOs, you can see these dashboards of SLOs, so that you can, when a ticket comes through or someone is, raising an issue, you can really easily go say and filter like, okay, well, let me see this customer, and then boom, I can kind of get a real-time snapshot of what performance is like for them. The other thing that, beyond democratizing data, is that SLOs let you bring in a lot of different data sources that are not just, I think when we talk, we tackle this from the technical perspective and we get very caught up in, what is the exact way we're getting stuff out of the code, right? Are we getting traces or metrics or logs or whatever? But with an SLO, you can also start to tie in things like user analytics, and you can say, you know, maybe our business, maybe our objective, right, is to improve, reduce the amount of clicks that takes to go from point A to point B. There was a really interesting article I read about web performance on this. And it was talking about, I believe it was from someone that worked at Kroger, the grocery store. And they had gone through and they did sort of a shootout of, here's a single page app with this framework, that framework, here's a native app, here's all these things. And what they did to kind of demonstrate the performance issues that actual customers were seeing was they bought a bunch of very inexpensive cell phones, just like really cheap cell phones. They throttled the data on them to be slow, as slow as possible, like you would be if you were in a rural area or you were, not on a really high powered fancy iPhone or whatever, right? And then they go through and they hand these out to everyone at their, on their team at this performance shootout to demonstrate, like, look how bad this user experience is. If you're someone that is kind of, you don't have, the fanciest, newest technology, you don't have high speed, super high speed internet, this is how long it takes. And that analytic data is something that they can track, and they can track that data, put it into an SLO and say, okay, instead of just looking at kind of these synthetic metrics that don't really tell us much, we can go and start to align ourselves around, what's the time to first content fulfill? Like, what's the time to painting all the elements? Like, how long until the page is responsive? Take those metrics and say, create a SLO of, I want it to take less than, a minute or less than 30 seconds to be able to kind of complete these searches for these key items, right? Eggs, milk, bread, whatever. That's something you can then go back to, not just CS, not just PMs, but that's something you can go back to, the actual business with, right? The logistics people, the executives. And you can say, look, we need to invest in web performance because we're tracking, like, it takes us, 30 seconds to do this. But if someone uses a different competitor's app, it takes them 10 seconds. What are people going to actually do at the end of the day? We want to make sure we're capturing, not only that we're serving our customers, but that we're able to kind of provide a better experience compared to our competitors. Here's a way that you can see that, see whatever O, and you can look at it and you can understand the actual dollar value of these performance team, the work that we're doing on performance. And that, to me, that's remarkable, because so many projects I've seen specifically around application performance and optimization tend to get derailed because it's not visible work to, to business leaders, right? Like, maybe they understand it, or they have some conception of like, yes, I need to do this, but without that SLO there as a way to really concretely tie the business value to what we're doing in the back end, you know, you're going to be stuck in a situation where things are a little more loosey goosey, right? Like, maybe you can show your dashboard of just like, well, we took this number down or this number went up, but without that sort of synthetic, that aggregate SLO of like, okay, this is why we're doing this. This is how it's making, the dollars, making us more dollars. Then all it takes is, some sort of shift or change, someone to come in that maybe doesn't understand the technology as well. And all those, performance programs just kind of get swept aside because you can't demonstrate the value of them.
What are the best type of telemetries that you will need, how to get the data that you need, so that once again teams are more efficient and business value is coming out quickly versus frustration.
Absolutely. I think the best way to get the telemetry to make a good SLO is through distributed tracing. And I think the best way to get distributed tracing data is to use projects like OpenTelemetry, to instrument your code, to instrument your distributed system, because OpenTelemetry and distributed traces will get you actual per user level, telemetry signals about how are people using the application, right? What is the, when I click on the checkout button, what happens? And I can see every step in that, right? You need to pair that underlying telemetry with, observability tooling, right? Like tools like Lightstep that can help you kind of aggregate all that data and store it. Tools like Noble9 to help you build these SLOs. But that's kind of a second, not a secondary one. Those are very important, but you really have to start with that high quality telemetry data, tracing first. You can bring in metrics to that, you can bring in logs to that, but really traces should be the bedrock of your SLO approach, just because that's going to give you the data at the right resolution, at the right place in your stack in order to build SLOs.
Now we talked about picking the right tools. Now let's also talk about some of the missteps or mistakes folks tend to make when they do approach SLOs and what they should avoid there.
That's a good one. I gotta think about this one a second. So I think the biggest mistake you can make on SLOs is trying to there's a sweet spot, is maybe the best way to think about it. I've seen people try to go and say, okay, we're going to switch everything over to SLOs. And if you have like, big enterprise system, you might have thousands, tens of thousands of alerts. You might have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of dashboards. Sitting down and saying, okay, we're going to boil the ocean. We're going to switch all this stuff over to SLOs. That's a real, that's just a painful amount of work. And there's no guarantee that people are going to like it, right? Like, I think the flip side of this is you can go too small. You can say, okay, we're going to pick this one thing kind of over in the corner that doesn't get a lot of use, and we're going to, implement SLOs there. And what you see in that case is you didn't really get enough data to make a good determination about, like, how is this actually impacting my actual end user, right? Maybe, well, if my end user is my calling service, like I can see things there, but I think you need to kind of, it's very much like Goldilocks and the Three Bears. You need to find the porridge that's just right. So a good place to start is identify, maybe sit down, rank a couple, five, let's say 5 or 10, really key interactions through multiple services in your system. They don't necessarily have to all be they don't have to be like the most trafficked things. They don't have to be like the absolute critical parts of it. They could be secondary subsystems. They can be, things like account management. They could be things like, if you want to focus internally, they can be around CI/CD, right? Like let's set SLOs on like how long does it take when we push code to actually get deployed to production. But you need to pick sort of a single subsystem that has multiple interactions, multiple steps through it, that is also has a really defined, something that you can sit back and say, okay, here's the dollar value, or maybe not the dollar value, but here's the business value of these interactions. Pick those and start there. And, again, start with one or two of those full journeys and take it kind of slow. Don't, you want to do things in parallel. So you don't turn off all the alerts on day one. You have your SLOs and your traditional alerts, and then start to cut over, teach people about SLOs, teach them how it's different, make sure you're taking notes on all this, make sure you're going and, kind of doing trainings, and you're gradually easing people in. And what I think you'll find is that as people start to see this, and as they start, as you turn down those old alerts and you're in the SLO only world, you're going to get people really interested, and they're going to say, well, hey, how can I do this for my service? How can I do that? Hey, I'm a front end engineer and I want to do this for the web app, or I want to do this for these authentication routes or whatever. And then you use that to kind of continue building out. So it's about finding those, key but not critical parts of the app and those systems, starting there, building a few and expanding out slowly and gradually, and building trust in the SLOs too. Because I think that's the other big difference, is that this is kind of radical in terms of, how it can change how you're prioritizing work and how you're prioritizing performance work versus other kinds. So it's really important to build trust in the measurements as you go forward.
Austin, thank you so much for taking time out today and, of course, talk about SLOs. Thanks for sharing those insights, and I would love to have you back on the show. Thank you.
Thanks. It's been great to be here again. See y'all next time.